A city sat like an island inside hostile territory, and the roads that fed it went silent, rail lines cut, barges stopped, power restricted, the math of survival collapsing by the hour. In the first days, the obvious assumption was simple. No modern capital could be supplied from the sky at scale, not through narrow corridors watched by an adversary, not without accidents, not without a single shot, turning into a war nobody could contain. And yet, that is exactly the bet that was made. Not a speech, not a treaty, but an operational decision. Keep flying, keep landing, keep unloading, and force the other side to decide whether it would fire first. Records from the crisis show how quickly the situation stopped being about food and coal and became something more fragile. Prestige, credibility, and whether holding Berlin meant holding the future of post-war Europe. This episode is not about miracles or slogans. It is about constraints. Too few troops, too many risks, an ally system still forming, and a Soviet blockade designed to make withdrawal feel rational. It is also about the trade-off at the center of Truman's choice, rejecting a ground push that could trigger shooting while refusing to accept a retreat that would rewrite the balance of power without a fight. So here is the mystery we're going to answer. How did an airlift become the safer option? What did it cost to keep it running day after day? And why did that choice reshape decisions for decades after the planes stopped landing? Stay with Rooms Where History, and let's trace the moment Truman bet the world's peace on a supply airlift over Berlin. How it worked, what it prevented, and what it quietly set in motion. To understand why the airlift was even thinkable, you have to start with the system created after 1945. Germany was divided into occupation zones, and Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, was itself divided among the occupying powers. That structure was never designed for a long standoff. It assumed cooperation would persist long enough to reach a political settlement. Instead, as the alliance hardened into suspicion, Berlin became a forward position with symbolic weight far beyond its geography, an exposed outpost that could not be defended like a normal city, but also could not be treated like a normal bargaining chip. Official historical accounts emphasize the basic instability. Millions of civilians in ruined conditions, a shattered economy, and a governance arrangement that required cooperation precisely when cooperation was disappearing. That is the first constraint to keep in view. The West's presence in Berlin was politically meaningful and militarily vulnerable at the same time. It looked like leverage, but it behaved like liability. And that contradiction is what the blockade would exploit. By 1947 and early 1948, policy choices outside Berlin began tightening the noose inside Berlin. The Western zones were being integrated economically, the Marshall Plan framework was taking shape, and Western officials pushed for currency reform to curb the black market and stabilize daily life. But currency reform is never just economics in an occupied city. It is sovereignty disguised as administration, because whoever controls money controls distribution and legitimacy. U.S. government accounts describe how the introduction of the Deutschmark in the Western zones and West Berlin, without Soviet agreement, was intended to restore order and enable recovery, while the Soviet side responded with its own currency moves and escalating pressure. This matters because it reframes the blockade. It was not simply a cruel tactic, and it was not simply a test either. It was an attempt to reverse momentum, make the Western position inside Berlin feel unsustainable, and make the political cost of staying exceed the political cost of leaving. Here is the hinge detail most people miss. The West's most defensible connection to Berlin was not a road or a rail line. It was an air agreement originally designed for safety, not for siege. On 30 November 1945, the Allied Control Council approved an arrangement that created a Berlin air control zone and established 3 air corridors linking Berlin to the western zones with a 4-power air safety system coordinating flights. Allied Control Council Berlin Air Safety Center. This did not guarantee access in a moral sense. Surface agreements existed too and were later ignored. But it created an asymmetry in escalation. If the West tried to reopen roads, it would likely require force. If the West kept flying in established corridors, stopping it would require the Soviets to initiate violence in the air. In other words, the corridors did not solve the logistical problem. They changed who would have to light the match. And the pressure had already been building before the blockade officially began. In early 1948, Soviet officials pressed for tighter control over corridor use, pushing demands like advance notifications and limits that would turn access into permission. The pattern included harassment and close encounters, and archival accounts describe a deadly April 1948 collision over Berlin after a Soviet fighter buzzed a British civilian aircraft, an event that underlined how quickly airspace friction could become catastrophe. This is a critical layer of context for Truman's decision. The air route was not a quiet humanitarian lane. It was a contested channel where a single misjudgment could be used as propaganda, or worse, could trigger escalation. So when later officials treated the airlift as the less risky option, it was not because the air was safe. It was because the ground was worse. Then, the blockade snapped shut. On June 24, 1948, Soviet forces blocked rail, road, and water access to Allied-controlled sectors of Berlin, cutting the arteries that fed a city of millions. U.S. official accounts describe the result in concrete terms: electricity restrictions, shortages of food and coal, and an immediate strategic question that could not be delayed: stay and supply the city, or retreat and accept the political consequences. The blockade was engineered to make time the weapon. Every day without supplies was not just hardship, it was a vote against the viability of Western presence. If the West faltered quickly, it would confirm a new reality: that Berlin could be absorbed into the Soviet sphere without a shot fired, simply by controlling access. In Washington and in Germany, the options on the table were brutally limited. And that's what makes the airlift decision so revealing. Option 1. Withdraw. It would save lives and resources in the short term and reduce the risk of immediate war. But it would also redefine Western credibility in Europe, signaling that pressure tactics worked. Option 2. Push a convoy through the blockade. That would defend access by principle, but it carried the highest escalation risk, because the moment a convoy met armed resistance, leaders would face a new cliff: back down under fire or fire back. Option 3. Supply by air, using the existing corridors, accepting an extraordinary logistical burden in exchange for a lower probability of ground combat. U.S. government histories underline how thin Western military options were in Berlin at the time compared to Soviet forces nearby, which made a direct confrontation especially dangerous. So the decision was never airlift or nothing. It was, which risk do you choose first? Truman's trade-off was political as much as military. If the United States retreated from Berlin under pressure, it would weaken the broader post-war project: economic recovery, alliance cohesion, and the credibility of American commitments at a moment when Europe was still deciding whether U.S. power would remain engaged or drift back across the Atlantic. But if Truman forced a ground confrontation, the costs could be immediate and irreversible. An incident at a checkpoint becomes an exchange of fire. An exchange becomes a crisis of alliance coordination. A crisis becomes a war that neither side publicly sought, but neither side could stop once it started. That is why the airlift appealed strategically. It allowed Truman to be firm without being first to shoot. It turned resolve into repetition, an everyday demonstration of capacity, while keeping the threshold for open war higher than a convoy would. The key is not that the airlift removed risk. It rearranged risk into a form Truman could manage. On the ground, General Clay, America's senior administrator in occupied Germany, had to translate strategy into a posture that would not collapse under its own contradictions. U.S. accounts preserve his blunt assessment from 13th June 1948. Maintaining the position in Berlin was not practicable on military grounds alone, but remaining was essential to prestige and had become a symbol of American intent, whether for good or bad. That line captures the core dilemma. Berlin could not be held by force without courting war, yet it could not be abandoned without paying a strategic price that might also invite future pressure elsewhere. Clay, working inside that trap, became central to the decision process because he embodied the crisis reality. He was measuring not ideals, but operational survivability and political meaning at the same time. Now zoom in on the mechanism that made the airlift strategically attractive. Escalation responsibility. The Berlin corridors existed under 4 power arrangements from 1945, and U.S. government accounts note the calculation behind the airlift. If the Soviet side used force against an unarmed humanitarian supply operation, it would appear as aggression and a violation of explicit agreements, shifting blame for conflict initiation. This is where logistics becomes diplomacy. The aircraft were not only carrying cargo, they were carrying a narrative of restraint. Every safe landing said, "We are here, we are supplying civilians, we are not firing." And that put the Soviet leadership in a narrow corridor of its own. Tolerate the airlift and accept failure of the blockade, or escalate in the air and assume the global consequences of firing first. The airlift began as improvisation, not as a polished plan. Official accounts place the blockade start on 24th June 1948 and describe how the United States and United Kingdom responded by airlifting food and fuel from Western Germany. Operation Victuals launched on June 26th, with the British following with Operation Planefare 2 days later. But improvisation has a half-life. If this was going to work beyond days or weeks, it needed scale, discipline, and a system that could survive weather, mechanical failure, human fatigue, and political doubt. That is why the next phase of the story is not glamorous. It is about turning an emergency air bridge into an industrial machine, one that could move coal, not just milk and medicine. Coal was the grim arithmetic at the center of the airlift. Food matters first, but coal keeps hospitals running, water systems functioning, and apartments barely warm when winter arrives. That meant tonnage targets became strategic targets, and failure became visible fast. The airlift's problem was not only distance, it was throughput. Limited runways, limited unloading capacity, narrow flight corridors, and a constant risk of bottlenecks that would turn airlift into symbolic gesture. The Soviet side likely understood that too, because a blockade does not have to starve a city to win. It only has to make the defenders admit their method cannot sustain. So the West had to prove not courage, but competence. Predictable deliveries, rising tonnage, and enough redundancy that one storm or one accident would not collapse the entire operation. This is where leadership shifts from decision to execution, and why names like Tunner matter. The Airlift needed a commander who thought in schedules, not speeches. Someone who would treat the corridor like a production line, where minutes were the scarce resource. Airlift histories describe how the operation evolved into a more centralized, efficient system, integrating allied roles and tightening procedures to increase reliability and output. And that shift reveals a deeper truth about Truman's bet. It depended on an institution, the Air Forces and their support networks, performing at a level that was not guaranteed. The Airlift was a test of capacity under pressure, and capacity is never just aircraft. It is maintenance, air traffic control, loading crews, fuel, weather forecasting, and the discipline to keep flying when success still looks improbable. The corridors forced an unusual kind of discipline. Congestion could kill even without enemy fire. Airlift accounts detail the operational reality: timed intervals, navigation checkpoints, altitude separations, and rules for planes in distress, because a single mistake could cascade into pileups that would reduce deliveries and increase fatalities. This is also where the Airlift becomes psychologically important. A well-run system communicates seriousness. The rhythm of arrivals, steady, repeatable, signals that the defenders are not improvising anymore. And once the Airlift looked routine, the blockade's pressure tactic began to lose its edge, because the West was no longer reacting, it was operating. Coalition politics mattered because the Airlift was, in practice, an alliance rehearsal. It required the United States and Britain to coordinate flight patterns, airfields, maintenance standards, and public messaging, while France's sector and decisions affected Berlin's internal balance as well. Airlift histories highlight the teamwork dimension. Supplies moved through multiple Western airfields, flown by Allied crews, unloaded by German labor, and supported by organizations spanning continents. This is not a sentimental point. It is strategic. A blockade tests whether an alliance can share risk without breaking. If partners begin to diverge, arguing about costs, rules, or headlines, the pressure tactic succeeds even if the city survives. So sustaining Berlin also meant sustaining agreement among the West on why Berlin mattered and what they were willing to pay to hold it. Inside Berlin, the Airlift had to do something harder than deliver supplies. It had to prevent panic and political collapse. Official accounts describe how hardships were real: rubble, scarce warmth, black market pressure. And yet, the city also became a stage where public resolve could influence strategic calculations. That is why public gatherings and political signals mattered. When hundreds of thousands of West Berliners demonstrated their opposition to Soviet domination and showed fear of abandonment, it strengthened the West's willingness to keep the Airlift and the currency reform in place. Not because crowds solve logistics, but because crowds change political risk. This is an uncomfortable reality of statecraft. Civilian morale becomes an input variable in elite decision-making. Truman's bet relied on Berliners not only enduring scarcity, but also making their endurance visible enough that retreat would look like betrayal, not prudence. Midway through the story, it helps to name the quieter enemy: winter and fatigue. Airlift histories describe how weather, low visibility, instrument conditions, fog, could turn a schedule into a gamble, and how planners had to build forecasting, procedures, and redundancy just to keep the corridor from becoming a graveyard. This is the breathing beat, where the tension drops slightly, not because the crisis relaxes, but because you can see what the crisis demanded. Sustained competence under conditions that punish arrogance. The airlift did not need a single heroic day. It needed hundreds of ordinary days where mistakes stayed small enough that the system could absorb them. Then comes the proof that the airlift was not just flying, it was engineering and adaptation. Airlift accounts describe how West Berlin expanded air capacity, including development work that enabled higher throughput and reduced reliance on a single runway pattern. This matters strategically because it changes the blockade's timeline. A blockade wins when it convinces defenders that their capacity is capped and declining. Every new improvement, faster unloading, better scheduling, expanded airfield capability, raised the ceiling. And once the ceiling rises, the bargaining position shifts. The West can talk about months, not days, which turns a Soviet pressure move into a Soviet long-term cost. While planes were landing, diplomats were negotiating, and the two tracks fed each other. Airlift histories describe how discussions narrowed around currency control in Berlin, whether the West would withdraw its currency changes in exchange for reopening routes, and how talks repeatedly approached almost before collapsing over enforcement and control mechanisms. This is the second major trade-off in Truman's bet. An airlift buys time, but time has a cost. It hardens positions. It creates sunk investments. It changes domestic politics on all sides. The longer the airlift ran, the more it became the new baseline, and the harder it became for either side to accept a compromise that looked like retreat. So even as the airlift reduced the immediate war risk, it also narrowed the space for a clean diplomatic exit. And the pressure did not flow only one way. U.S. historical accounts note that the Western response included an Allied counter-blockade that created shortages in the Soviet zone and raised fears in Moscow about political fallout. This is where the crisis becomes a duel of endurance rather than a duel of force. The Soviets could impose hardship on Berlin, but they could not isolate themselves from economic strain and political consequences elsewhere. The West could endure the financial and operational costs of an airlift, but only if it could keep public support and alliance coordination intact. Over time, the blockade stopped being a lever and started becoming a liability, because it failed quickly enough to humiliate, yet persisted long enough to exhaust. Now raise the tension again. Accidents and escalation risk never disappeared. Airlift histories record fatalities and crashes over the operation, which meant every successful day carried a quiet ledger of risk. But the more explosive risk was political. What if the Soviets fired on an aircraft, forced it down, or engineered an incident that made continued flights look reckless? Truman's calculation, as described in official accounts, was that attacking the airlift would look like aggression against a humanitarian mission and violate existing arrangements, pushing responsibility for escalation onto the attacker. That did not guarantee restraint, but it shaped incentives. It made stopping the airlift expensive for Moscow. In a way, stopping a convoy might not have been, because ground incidents can be framed as security, while downing aircraft reads as war. By spring 1949, the airlift had matured into something the blockade did not anticipate, a system that could surge. Airlift histories describe the Easter Parade on April 16, 1949, when aircraft landed in Berlin at an interval measured in roughly a minute. An industrial tempo that turned what once looked impossible into routine. The strategic meaning of that surge is bigger than the tonnage. It told Moscow that waiting would not solve the problem. It told Berliners that endurance had a payoff. And it told Allies that coordination could produce results under stress. A blockade relies on the defender's doubt. The Easter Surge attacked doubt directly by proving capacity at scale. Once the airlift proved it could sustain Berlin indefinitely, the blockade's logic inverted. Official accounts date the end of the crisis to 12 May 1949, when Soviet forces lifted the land access blockade. Some accounts describe it as late 11th May into early 12th May, depending on timing. That timing detail matters less than the strategic fact. Moscow backed away not because it suddenly accepted Western policy, but because the blockade was no longer producing the intended concession. Instead, it was strengthening Western unity, increasing U.S. credibility, and locking Berlin into the role of a symbolic frontier, exactly what the blockade was meant to prevent. Even after land routes reopened, the airlift did not end immediately. Airlift histories note that flights continued into late 1949 to build stockpiles against the possibility of renewed pressure, because trust had been spent and could not be quickly restored. This is a subtle cost of the decision. Once you solve a crisis with an extraordinary mechanism, you may need to keep that mechanism alive longer than the crisis itself, because the strategic environment it revealed does not disappear when the immediate trigger is removed. The airlift, in that sense, was not only a response, it was a rehearsal for a new kind of long confrontation, one where logistics, signaling, and endurance mattered as much as divisions and tanks. The aftermath hardened the structure of Europe. U.S. accounts link the Berlin crisis to the consolidation of East-West division, noting that the Western Allies created North Atlantic Treaty Organization shortly before the blockade ended, and that the establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany followed soon after, with East Germany created in response. Be careful with causality here. The airlift did not cause every later step, but it changed incentives and confidence. It proved that the West would bear costs to hold positions it considered symbolically vital. And it taught Moscow that pressure tactics could backfire by producing the very cohesion they were meant to fracture. Now we can finally evaluate Truman's decision in the terms that matter. Trade-offs, not triumph. Short term, the airlift achieved the essential objective. West Berlin stayed supplied, and the West avoided a direct ground clash that could have sparked open war. Official histories emphasize that outcome, and the crisis ended in May 1949. But the decision also carried quieter costs. It elevated Berlin into a permanent symbol, which meant future crises there would carry amplified stakes. It normalized the idea that credibility could be defended through extraordinary measures, which can strengthen deterrence but also trap leaders into escalation ladders later. And it validated a form of confrontation where civilian suffering became a bargaining instrument, something neither side invented in 1948, but both sides learned to integrate into strategy afterward. So Truman's bet was not peace at any price. It was avoid the shooting war today, accept the long confrontation tomorrow. And this is why the airlift remains a blueprint for a certain type of statecraft. It shows how leaders sometimes win by choosing the channel where the opponent must bear the escalation burden. The air corridors were not just routes. They were a rule-based environment that narrowed Moscow's choices, because the act of stopping flights carried reputational and strategic consequences that were harder to control. At the same time, the airlift shows how fragile, non-violent confrontation can be. Every landing was a small victory, but also a reminder that modern power is often exercised through systems, supply chains, schedules, maintenance cycles, diplomatic framing, not only through battlefield maneuvers. Truman's decision worked because it aligned several layers at once: an operational mechanism that could scale, a diplomatic narrative that made escalation costly for the other side, and a political commitment strong enough to survive months of doubt. None of those layers was automatic. Each had to hold. So what did Truman's choice achieve? In the short term, it kept West Berlin alive and prevented a confrontation on the roads that could have forced an immediate decision between humiliation and gunfire. It also demonstrated a principle that mattered in 1948. The West would not be pushed out of a legally and politically defined position simply by pressure, scarcity, and deadlines. What did it risk or damage? It made Berlin a permanent high-stakes symbol where future leaders could feel compelled to prove resolve even when conditions changed. It deepened the division of Europe by accelerating alignment and counter-alignment, and it showed both sides that civilians could become instruments inside strategic contests, fed, frozen, pressured, rescued, and then cited as proof of legitimacy. And here is the price: the explicit trade. Truman bought time and stability without firing first, but he paid with money, aircrew lives, constant accident risk, and the long-term commitment of U.S. prestige to a single exposed city. He chose a path that reduced the chance of immediate war, while accepting a structure of prolonged confrontation that would shape policy for decades. The deeper lesson is analytical, not moral. In a crisis, the best option is often the one that relocates danger into a domain where you can control tempo, rules, and responsibility, because controlling escalation is sometimes the only form of victory available. But that kind of victory always leaves residue. Symbols harden, expectations rise, and the next crisis inherits the logic of the last. If this episode helped you see the Berlin airlift as a strategic decision, not a legend, please take a moment to like the video. It helps Rooms Where History reach more viewers who want calm, evidence-minded storytelling instead of slogans. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the closed-door decisions that redirected history, what leaders knew, what they couldn't know, and what their choices set in motion. And I genuinely like to hear from you. In a crisis like this, where do you think the line is between resolve and escalation? Leave a comment with your view and tell us where you're watching from. Thank you for spending your time with Rooms Where History and for keeping the focus on decisions, constraints, and consequences.